waylaid in the labyrinthian parlor with all of the treats and fun stuff going on there. But I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for Carole. And before Carole starts, we have a word from our generosity folks. That is today, Jay Hardcastle. So, Counselor, if you would come and bring us a word.
I'm here to talk about money. Carole, I might take some of your time away here unless you've all come up with a check, and then I'll sit down. So, right, I'm going to work you into this spiel. So I want to know if you feel a sense of urgency, because I do. I think of the story about the woman who poured the expensive oil, perfumed oil on Jesus's head, provoking the irritation of the disciples. And thus the famous line in Matthew, "The poor will be with you always, but you only have me for a little while." I think we'll only have each other for a little while. We need to get serious about it here. And sort of like the bumper sticker says, Jesus is coming, look busy. But we've got a lot to do here. Everybody's got their favorite mission. We've got, in our household, is probably Westminster Home Connection, Room in the Inn, Nations Ministry, Martha O'Brien. We've all got that. We've got a lot of sermons. We've got a big campus. And we have a very expensive city, and inflation of the likes that hasn't been like we've seen historically from 2019 to now. Our giving has been about flat. We've done about $3 million worth of pledge gifts. And now we're about this year, about maybe $3,150,000. So inflation is going up at a rate higher than that, especially that's sort of 5 years worth of increases. And the inflation rate is now that works out to be about 2.3%. Inflation is a lot higher than that. And we also have increased security. So if you want to think about some stats here, we've got number of pledges about 425, number of unpledged gifts about 375, and we've got 1,200 giving units. So there's room for more people to give, and there's room for the same people to give more. So our budget next year is going to be about $4 million, and we got about $3,150,000 worth of pledges in for this year, and $500,000 ish in unpledged gifts. So you can see there's going to be a gap there unless we all step up. So I'm hoping people will take last year's pledge, multiply that by 1.1, which will allow a little slippage for people who can't get there, which to the 8% target. And my real goal is that someone will be here like Carole in a generation or two hence, and they will be giving a story about us and how we made Westminster last. Thank you.
It's really an honor for me to be here today. I don't need that microphone, but I've got one on me. I'll be wired up here. It's an honor for me to be here. The history of this church, Ray and I have been members for 49 years. And, you know, there's at least 2 generations now that we have seen pass. And we are, you know, seeing ourselves needing to go to the end of life meeting, planning meetings and things of that nature. But this church has a wonderful heritage. And I think if you look at the history of the church, you see this really strong pattern of growth all the way to today. Now, certainly there have been a few dips, but then there have been economic recessions and other things. But this church is a strong church. And if you start really down there where 21st and West End kind of come to that point, coming out this way, you see so many churches that have very, very low attendance and no families with children to speak of. And it's part of the society that we live in, because when this church was built, there were no stores open on Sunday. There were no professional sports teams here. There were no children's sports activities. going on in the morning in Sunday during the Sunday school hour. And church now has a lot of competition. And I think Westminster, I remember very well, we were having a congregational meeting a few years ago, and we were in here, and Patrick Warfield stood up and said, you know, Westminster is this sweet spot, and we are fortunate. Churches are fragile institutions, and this one is no exception. So I think that history serves several purposes. It's really here to inspire us and to look at these people and look at what they've done over the years. And we have had, every generation has had its leaders, and every generation has dealt with various crises and come through those crises successfully. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today, are some people that I picked out based on initially the plaques that are around the church. And then I will next week talk about some of the pastors, but not all of them, none that are living. So, Guy, I won't be talking about any living pastors. So, the Lord be with you. Let us pray. God of us all, those assembled here in this great cloud of witnesses, and those gathered on earth today, as we remember those who have gone before us. May we live according to the teaching example of Christ as they did, through the empowerment of the Holy Spirit in our lives. Now, how many of you have anybody at all whose name is on the list out here, the things in the crosswalk out there, of all the charter members? You do, and whose name is that? Not that I will necessarily know them, but
4 grandparents, 2 parents.
you are tied. You are tied. Are there any Harwells here today? There are Harwells all over the church history. The Harwells were an important part of the life of this congregation. And, you know, we don't really pay much attention to these people. I mean, there's certainly a lot of lineage societies around that look at their ancestry as part of their identity. But here at Westminster, we don't do that. When I went through some of the church minutes, it was interesting to look at the people who joined the church up until really about the 1960s. And all the overwhelming predominance of people who joined this church were always from a Presbyterian congregation. And now, if you look at the list, they're from churches all over the place. They're all denominations, Protestants, Catholics, you name it. We have a much more diverse body of members from the point of view of their heritage and what they have been accustomed to and have decided to come here for some particular reason. My guess is that almost everybody in this room, when you join this church, you joined it because somebody here shook your hand after church and said, "Oh, here, I'm Nancy Langdon. I don't think I know you, and we're glad you're here and hope you'll come back." I mean, it's as simple as that. But, you know, we are now not doing that kind of thing quite as much, I think, as we used to. So here you know, I bet many of us, when we were children, I certainly did this with my parents. We went to a cemetery on a regular basis in Honey Grove, Texas. It's a thriving metropolis. Its population's about 1,500 now. It is a lovely old pre-Civil War cemetery, but all of my family is buried out there. My parents, my brother, both sets of my grandparents, some of my great-grandparents are buried out there. And we went regularly on Sunday afternoon. We would not go every Sunday, but we would go and put Mother's Day and Father's Day and the holidays and the birthdays. And my mother took that as her obligation. Well, now everybody's families are so dispersed geographically that you never really see very many people doing that. And I think evidence of that was very clear last year when we went out to Mount Olivet, and there were trees down everywhere, and so many of the markers had been broken and were not in good shape out there. So here we are here to talk about the people who came before us. And I will try to be very brief with the backstory. First of all, Nashville was settled by primarily Scots-Irish Presbyterians. Now, they were people of faith, but unlike what some people believe, they did not come across the mountains and then come across the Cumberland Plateau here to Middle Tennessee because they wanted to spread the gospel and have a Presbyterian church. They came for opportunity. And the opportunity in the 1770s and 80s, around the time of the American Revolution, the opportunity was to own your own land. Land meant independence, and there was abundant land here, even though this area here around Nashville was in fact a common hunting ground of Native American tribes from West Tennessee, from Alabama and Southern Tennessee, from the Smoky Mountains. The tribes heavily contested the presence of these Anglo-Americans here. And they didn't really, it took them about 10 years to finally stake their claim. The settlers that came here, it took them that long to be free of Indian warfare. It was so bad that the native tribes tried so hard to keep this property that about half of the population of Nashboro, Fort Nashboro, this area here, had left within 2 years or been killed in Indian warfare. And so by the people that here had that to worry about, but they were determined, those who stayed were absolutely determined they were gonna stay no matter what. And so when things kind of calmed down a little bit in about 1785, James Robertson and some of the other leaders of this fledgling community here decided that it was time to find themselves somebody to run a school. They needed a school. These people put a high value on education. And only one of the 250 or so people who signed the Cumberland Compact could not write his name. These people were literate people, and they wanted their children educated. And so they found a pastor up in Kentucky. Now, he had a few runs with the Presbytery and the Synod up there, and he had been in North Carolina, but he was named Thomas Craighead, and he was brought down here to open a school. Preaching was optional, but he came down here to open a school. And because of the lack of security where the heart of the city is, where the courthouse and the public square are, because of that, they put this school out on what is now the Gallatin Pike, very near that veteran cemetery. And so they started this school, which he called Davidson Academy. Now, preaching was probably not in his job description. I don't think he had a contract. He came and he did do some preaching, but he did not go into what became the heart of Nashville and say, we need to get a congregation going, we need to start a church. So the Methodists were the first ones to actually establish a church here in what is now regarded as Nashville. The Methodists were more suited for the frontier than the Presbyterians, and they came in as mostly circuit riders after that the first Great Awakening. They came here and they adapted very well to the frontier. So the first church inside Nashville was McKendree Methodist Church. It is downtown, a block away from downtown Presbyterian, our mother church. Now, there were Baptists in the area too, but they did not want to be in a village. They preferred to be out in the country. And so the Baptists started a Mill Creek Baptist Church with Reverend Whitsitt, and it was out towards the airport, but a little bit south off of I-65. And they did fairly well with that congregation. But the Presbyterians were not really eager to have a church. They were not interested in starting one. The Mill Creek Baptist Church cemetery is hard to find, but if you find it, the Whitsitts have a very interesting family history out there. And so finally, in 1814, the Presbyterians decide maybe we should start a church. And a pastor had come from Franklin, and that was kind of the impetus for this. Now, 1814, when we were in the process of founding a Presbyterian church here, there was a lot in the news, especially about our Tennesseans, because Andrew Jackson had gone down with our militia and defeated the Creeks at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and then he was on his way to New Orleans. So people were distracted, and there weren't many men in town. But this pastor met with these women at the courthouse square, the public square, and they had one man with them because, you know, if you're going to have a congregation, you have to have an elder. And of course, that eliminated all of the women. And so that was how the Presbyterians first got started. Now, here is Anne Rogers Grundy, who wasn't one of the charter members of that church, but what she was a woman who was interested in solving social problems. And one of the problems was illiteracy, and the other problem was a lot of vagrancy on the short streets of downtown Nashville. So she had been in Kentucky. Her husband, Felix Grundy, had been a judge in Kentucky, and he came to Tennessee so that he could be closer to all the land offerings down in Alabama and Mississippi, which had not been created as states. And he became a U.S. Senator from Tennessee. He was James K. Polk's law partner. And so she founds this Bible Society. It was patterned on one that had started in Philadelphia. And so the women partnered not with the Presbyterian minister, but with the Methodist minister, Samuel Ament, and they started what became known as Sunday school. Now, Sunday schools did not originate here. They originated in England, but it was a way to start spreading the word. And one thing you really see loud and clear in all the minutes of Westminster, which go back to right after the Civil War, what you see is all of the interest in evangelism. The church, the Presbyterian church, our church had revivals, and they participated very actively in a Sam Jones revival. They helped pay for a big tent downtown on Broadway. They paid for a floor to be put in it, and they had 2 weeks of hellfire and damnation from Sam Jones, who built the Ryman Auditorium for Captain Ryman, who was saved at one of his revivals. So these women are passing out Bibles, but of course, guess what? Some of the preachers don't like it because, you know, women aren't supposed to be doing these things. But we did have some women, and Moore Memorial, our real church, this congregation is Moore Memorial. It just has a different name. It didn't break away, it just moved. But this church always had women doing a lot of things, particularly, Jay, in the field of raising money, having rummage sales, making aprons and selling them, all sorts of things they were doing to raise money for More Memorials Church. So here we've got Ann Rogers Grundy here, and First Presbyterian Church does grow, but they have this sense to spread the word. They have this need to create other congregations. So the Baptists were out in the county, but they were not downtown until 1822. So now you have the three major Protestant denominations, and the Catholics come in about this time, 1822. Irish Catholics were brought here to build the first bridge across the Cumberland River, and they had a church, St. Mary's of the Seven Sorrows, on the northeast corner of the grounds of the Capitol. That was the deal. They were allowed to build a church there. The founders, the people that brought them here, helped build that church for them. So here is the latest rendition of what was the First Presbyterian Church. If you've never been in there, it is really something to see. Some people find this very unchristian. Others find it a architectural wonder. It was built in the 1850s. William Strickland had come here to design the Tennessee State Capitol, which he did, Greek Revival.
Have you ever read the section minutes when the building committee made the recommendation? I think that was exactly.
It is very interesting how they're making how these decisions are getting made at all of these churches. And this, you know, except for a cross on the altar, not in the architecture or any of this, are there any crosses? You see symbols of Ra everywhere, the Egyptian sun god, but there are no crosses in this. And they've been lucky enough to get money to keep this all up and to keep it in such good shape. But this was the third building they had. One thing you see, and you even see this coming all the way out here in the 1930s and 40s, how many fires destroyed things here in Nashville. This was the third building that the Presbyterians had on that piece of property, and the other two had burned. And so McKendree had a fire, and they had to build another church. I mean, there've been lots of church fires, and as this area of Richland got established, there were house fires here all the time, including one that some of you will remember that took place in the house that was probably about right where we are, the Gray House, which the people at More Memorial bought the front half of their property, their front yard essentially, and put the church right there. But all we had at that point was just a sanctuary. So here are the Presbyterians felt that they needed to plant seeds and evangelize. And so here is a list of the churches that all have sprung directly or indirectly from First Presbyterian Church. And look at this, look at how many we have. And most of these churches don't even exist anymore. Many of them didn't last after the Civil War. And even those that have been founded since the Civil War, some of them are in very, very fragile condition. Not just the building, but the congregations have shrunk to such a high degree. But the way that they did this was getting an elder in the church and then some members, generally almost always women, to go out and start a Sunday school in a particular neighborhood. So Second Presbyterian Church started out above where the courthouse is today in a warehouse. And they eventually built a church. And when Tennessee seceded from the Union, the Second Presbyterian Church supported the Union, and it was the only church that was allowed to stay open after the Union Army occupied Nashville in early 1862. So they were very strong Unionists. These other churches, well, Edgefield is now the Woodland Street church over, and then here comes Moore Memorial after the Civil War. You know, the Civil War, Nashville came out better in terms of physically the city during the Civil War than any other capital of a southern state, because Richmond was burned, Atlanta was burned, there were soldiers everywhere. But because the Union Army came in 1862 and raised the Union Jack over the capital and then took over the government, we didn't have any damage until the very near the end of the war, when the Battle of Nashville took place on the south side of town, primarily out there on that ridge above Harding Place, past Green Hills, kind of where Covenant Presbyterian Church is out there. So Moore Memorial got started. Now, in 1879, they founded a different church in South Nashville, but they call it Westminster. And it's no relation to us. It didn't last very long, but they had that church. And so you see they named some for the elders, and Edgar was one of the pastors. A.J. Adams was an elder. Glenn Levin was founded by a pastor at Moore Memorial who was a Confederate chaplain. Moore Memorial, the congregation that developed there, overwhelmingly Confederate roots. People had, many had been in the Confederate Army. And so when we brought our third pastor here to Moore Memorial, or no, he was our second one, J. Hugh McNeely, he decided that he wanted to have a ministry to Confederate veterans, and that's indirectly how Glenn Levin Presbyterian Church got started, and he became the pastor over there. He was a man who never saw a piece of paper that he didn't need to write something on. And his materials are all down at the state archives. He wrote articles for the Confederate Veterans magazine. He wrote Defenses of the South. Here, there, and yon. He was very much, until his death, wrapped up in the Civil War, as a lot of others were, but not necessarily ministers. So here you see all of these churches that got founded. And then after, well, on December 7th, 1941, the pastor at the First Presbyterian Church was a pacifist, and he had joined Charles Lindbergh's America First, stay out of the war, stay out of World War I. And then that day he preached about that, and everybody went home and heard on their radios that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. So he and his followers ended up founding Trinity Presbyterian Church because they were the people that had opposed the U.S. entry into World War II. So then in 1955, the First Presbyterian Church was in the throes of a decision. They had a lot of land around the church. I mean, they had parking lots, and they had built on the back of the Egyptian building a kind of like this. They built a 4-story Sunday school building that was designed by Henry Hibbs, and it has architectural significance. But they decided the presbytery was going to create an Oak Hill Presbyterian Church. But one of the members of First Pres offered the church their estate out on Franklin Road, which is Oak Hill, the Cheek House, which is attached to First Pres out there now. And so they moved the congregation, and that has left some scars. The people who were here in 55, there's some scars that will not ever heal about that. They stayed downtown, one of which is Ridley Wills Sr., and he's very devoted to that congregation today. But nonetheless, they split, and First Pres moved out. And then First Pres has had its own little crises. And so it then a group left and founded Christ Presbyterian Church, which is a Presbyterian Church of America. And then Covenant sprang from Christ Presbyterian Church. So that's a lot of seeds that have been planted, and some have thrived considerably better than others. Now, this map of Nashville, I think, shows you how little it was at this particular time that Moore Memorial was being founded. This subdivision right here, this area right in here was being, this was kind of South Nashville. And then when you got a little bit further over, you see the Methodists are going to start Vanderbilt here across from what becomes Centennial Park. There was a West End Park over there. But up here, the Beeman Pontiac, where it used to be, was a pretty thriving new-ish neighborhood like East Nashville had already become before the Civil War. So here you've got a lot of Davidson County, but the city of Nashville, its city limits, are still, relatively speaking, very small. So here is George O'Brien. Now, you know his sister's name far better than him. Martha O'Brien was his sister. And they were members of the First Presbyterian Church. He was a Confederate veteran. Martha O'Brien had a very tragic love story. She was engaged to a Confederate soldier during the war, and he was caught for the second time spying crossing the Canadian border at Niagara Falls back into the United States, and President Lincoln had him executed. And so that was why she never married and did all of the charitable work that she did. It's a really an interesting story about how he became a Confederate spy. And some people tie that, his execution by Lincoln, to John Wilkes Booth and the reason that John Wilkes Booth assassinated Lincoln. If you're interested in this story, just send me an email and I can send you something to read. But George O'Brien and his brother were in the Confederate Army. And when the war ended, they decided to start a business. Now, the O'Briens and all of these other veterans knew there were a lot of surplus things around left over from the war. And so they started buying army tents. And they took this old, what would you call it, canvas? It's what these heavy old tents were made out of, and started making overalls. So they became the makers of the Duckhead brand of, and you don't see many people running around these days with a Duckhead label on their shirt or their khaki pants. But, you know, when I was in college and up in the 70s, lots of people had those Duckhead pants and things. And they did very, very well in this business. So they started manufacturing the overalls was the first thing they started with. And then they moved into more fashionable. As the times changed, they kind of upped what they were making here. But they started with that factory down there in the Market Street, 2nd Avenue area. And he was a very devoted Christian. And so when they decided they needed to start, we've got to get things going. We've grieved now for 8 years, I suppose, over the Civil War. It's time to move on. And so they decided they were coming west. And George O'Brien volunteered to lead the group. And so they started a Sunday school in this neighborhood. They went door to door. They rented the carriage house, a bigger house. And then the women went door to door and they started a Sunday school. So within 2 years, they were ready to have a church. Now, the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church at this time was a man by the name of Thomas Verner Moore. And he was very frail, and he passed away about 1869. And so as a way to memorialize him and honor his life, he had come from Richmond to First Pres because he had moderated a general assembly that took place at First Pres, and the Moore Memorial people heard him preach and thought he was great and said, well, not the Moore Memorial people, the First Pres people thought he was great, and we'll put him in, I asked him to become our pastor. So he died, and he had a he was physically very frail. So they're going to ultimately start a church. And of course, you have to get presbytery permission. You know, in those days, the whole structure of the Presbyterian Church was really basically a structure of courts. You know, the congregation, and keep in mind, the congregation is democratic. At least we're electing men to be on the session and run the church, and males as pastors. And then the presbytery is over them, and then over them is the synod, and then up at the top is the General Assembly. So when the denomination split in the 1850s over slavery, the northern churches stayed separate from the southern churches, and the southern churches, every General Assembly from 1867 on in the South, everyone, the Northern General Assembly sent them a telegram and said, we would like to reunite. And every time until 1983, every time they said no. And so it took that long for the wounds of the Civil War to heal here. And so they're going to start this Sunday school, and they're going to name, the Sunday school goes very well. They're going to start a church, and they're going to call it Moore Memorial in memory of Thomas Verner Moore. Now, he had a son who was a lawyer. And his son had apparently never really gone to church. And he, when his father died, it shocked him so much that he decided to go to Germany and get theological training. And then he came back. And so when this church, Moore Memorial, in recognition of his father, is started, then what you see is him, the son, becoming the pastor. And he thought he wanted to be a pastor, but things did not go particularly well for him. And he was very outspoken. And you know, one of the things that had more trials in that court hierarchy of the Presbyterian Church than anything else, it wasn't drinking, it wasn't gambling, it was breaking the Sabbath. And anybody, people, they had trials in the General Assembly. I'm sure some lawyer type, John Bailey, would love doing a paper about this, all these trials that the Presbyterians had. But they had a General Assembly at Moore Memorial in the 1890s, and they tried a woman named Sadie Means from Columbia, South Carolina, for breaking the Sabbath. And she had been convicted by and thrown out of her own church, the First Presbyterian Church of Columbia, South Carolina. Then the presbytery had affirmed her conviction, and then the synod overturned the presbytery's decision. And so she brought it to the General Assembly. And it really looked like in this trial, the General Assembly lasted 10 days. In this trial, her trial only lasted 2 or 3. But she was, they finally ruled to affirm the Synod's decision on the grounds that she hadn't had due process of law. And so she had not been able to speak in her own defense. Her occupation, she was a single woman. She was 17 or 18 years old. And she was convicted of working on the Sabbath because she supported herself and her job was telephone operator. Well, let me tell you, pretty much everybody at Moore Memorial, as soon as they had the money, they got hooked up to a telephone because the Warner family had started the telephone company and a transit authority of sorts with these streetcars. And so she worked on Sunday. And so it looked like the General Assembly might be ready to convict this woman, but no, somebody got up and started talking about how many of you have a telephone? How many of you use your telephone? How many of you use your telephone on Sunday? And so that was really apparently what changed. But I've never been able to learn anything about what happened to her, what she did afterwards. I did find some information that she got married, but beyond that, I don't know what she did or where she went to church. I doubt it was to the Presbyterian church that threw her out. But this church really took off, and it took off a little bit faster than First Pres expected it to. And so when Moore Memorial does kind of get stabilized and starts really growing, that makes the people in the First Presbyterian Church very nervous because this is written in their history that Damaris Still wrote about 15 or 20 years ago. It's a 2-volume set of history of First Pres. It appears that there was so much growth taking place at Moore Memorial, more than any other Presbyterian church, including theirs. They got very nervous. And this is not a very Christian thing to say, but the reason they got so nervous, and this is written in her history, is that the wealthier people of the congregation were leaving First Pres to join Moore Memorial. And so I don't think I would have written that in my history if I were writing the history of that episode in the church. Now, here are the charter members of Moore Memorial. Any of you kin to any of these people? Mattie Brown was still around when the groundbreaking took place here in 1937. Now, they were the charter members, but that didn't necessarily mean they had any authority because they were just the people who had put their names on the paper. So it had to get legitimized through the county government. And I don't really know anything about what the county clerk I do have some vague notion of what the county clerk does, but apparently they had to fill out an application to raise money and to be incorporated, so to speak, and the presbytery had to approve it. I'm getting ahead of myself here. So here is the building that followed. It was built in 1874. It faced Broadway. The Methodists came out that very same year and founded West End Methodist in that area. A little bit later, the Baptists came out and founded Emmanuel Baptist across the street over there where Jim Reed Chevrolet used to be. I guess they're still calling some of that Jim Reed, I don't know. The Subaru place, I guess, is there. And so this is what it looked like. And this is the only picture I've ever been able to find of the interior of this church. I would love to have seen it. And West End Methodist looked remarkably like this. And yet, in the 1930s, they thought nothing about just leveling it and moving further out. That was, Americans are not savers. And we haven't been preservers very well until more recent years. So here we start looking at these plaques, and the Harwell family was very, very active in this congregation when it was Moore Memorial and when it moved out here. And so this plaque is on the walls of the chapel here on our property. And the chapel wasn't built until 1948. But they wanted to honor the memory of this son who was about 18 years old when he died. And all the newspapers I could ever find was that he had some terrible fever. And I don't know whether it was an epidemic. You know, there were a lot of epidemics going around, and, you know, way up till about 1900, the people in Nashville did not really believe in germ theory. And John Berrien Lindsley, who was a Presbyterian and member of First Pres, he became the state health director. And he kept saying, we're drinking unsanitary water. And Dr. Bowling, who has a prominent street here named for him, he gets, no, it's their diet. They need to eat fruit. And he created this Bowling anti-cholera diet. And his thing was, you've got to eat healthier things. And they didn't have junk food and processed food like we do. But anyway, he died. And his family grieved mightily for him. He was in his prime. He was 18 and he got sick. And the newspapers, it's really interesting what the newspapers say about people, especially of this age. And something on that obituary said something to the effect of, he had made his peace with the Lord. He had decided he was willing to go. And it's really something that you would never see in the paper today. But the Harwell history was built long after the sanctuary was built, I guess, several years there after the war. So we also have, when they decided to move out here, there was no remnant who wanted to stay downtown. They all wanted to go because this suburb, Richland Avenue, this suburb, Richland suburb, had just been built. And, you know, there are very few of those houses still left from here, from Wilson Boulevard to Bowling down there on the face West End, you know, but there were lots sold, all were the same size. And then the lots behind them on Richland Avenue, and then came Central, and then the houses became more like the smaller houses and bungalows. But those of you who come that way to church, you know that the Free Will Baptist Bible College bought some of that property, and then they've sold it several years ago. But their library still stands. And I went with some folks from the Historical Society over there to look at the house where the Free Will Baptist Library was. It is truly magnificent. I mean, it would probably cost $2 million to redo the house. Somebody bought it, but this has been 5 or 6 years ago. It's never been moved into. And it's inside, the paneling and everything is just stunning, but it's sitting empty. So here we are finally able to move, but it's 1935 and 6, and we're talking about this. Moore Memorial, in its very short history, had discussed moving 7 times. And they had that beautiful building. And so people were just ready to go. They were ready to go. So nonetheless, when they did come out here, and they bought this property, they had been offered a piece of the property of MBA, but they liked this piece better when they found out that the Gray family, who lived in a beautiful house here, that this family was willing to sell basically their front yard. And so they decided to buy this. You know, this is what's kind of going on for those of you who come down Bowling, in front of that house at the corner of Woodlawn and Bowling. That was Matt Glasgow's house. And they've put 2 houses in front of it. And, you know, they're trying to save the house back there, but it's really an odd situation. And that was exactly what the Presbyterians did. So they only had enough money to build a sanctuary. They had no money for pews. They had no money for much of anything, but they built this sanctuary and had a worship service in it. But, you know, a big important part of a church is Sunday school, and they had no place to have Sunday school. So what they did was that they decided they would rent one of these houses down the street. And they rented I guess most people call those 4 square houses, 4 rooms down and 4 up. And they rented one of those houses for Sunday school classes for children. And the children would walk down there with their teacher and then walk back. And even when Westminster started in the late 1840s, 1848 or 49, the General Assembly of the Southern Churches was encouraging Presbyterian churches to start kindergartens. And so Hazel Fisher from this congregation went to Atlanta to a meeting, and then she opened what became the Westminster Kindergarten, and it met down there during the week in this house that was owned by the church. So the church ultimately bought the house. That $75 rent was pretty steep, and they bought the house, and then turned around a few years later when they built the first educational building. And looking at the footprint of this church as it has grown, it's pretty unbelievable. But they built right there where the parlor is. It was not nearly that big. And they had classrooms, and up where the choir room was, there were classes up there as well. And so they didn't build that till after World War II. But they had those Sunday school classes down there, and then they started this kindergarten here. And it really thrived, and it has now given up the kindergarten and is the Westminster School for Young Children. But the Harwells were very involved in all of this, and Coleman Harwell himself knew this family tree, I'm pretty sure, backwards and forwards. But it's really kind of interesting thing that there's so many Harwells in this particular history. Now, Margaret Liston. How many of you have ever heard of Margaret Liston? She has her name on something here. It was a Sunday school class, and the Sunday school class, this was, I mean, all of us can remember being in one of these classes of young mothers who wanted their own Sunday school class. So they named their class, somebody had some relationship with this Presbyterian nurse who was a medical missionary in the Congo, and they brought her here to Nashville to speak, and then they named their class after her, and they communicated with her and sent things to her quite regularly. But they were women who were wanting to serve here at Moore Memorial. Now, Barbara Jones, I will say this very directly, it's Greg's mother. And she was the loveliest person. She loved this church, would you agree? And she had 3 children here, Christopher, who lives in Japan, and Jordan, who lives here, who is one of my daughter's closest friends. Barbara had a very long, protracted case of breast cancer and died. And so the fellowship hall, which is kind of that whole area down there where Good Pasture Hall is today, the fellowship hall was renovated and made a whole lot nicer than it had been. It was just a basement until the 1950s, and then William Hume, who was a very active member of the church, and his widow had no children, and then she gave their whole estate to Westminster to fix that area up. So it's called the Hume Center now, or it was called the Hume Center, and now it's Good Pasture Hall. But the Good Samaritan class, which was co-ed couples, has met down there for years and years and years and years. But Barbara's name, this plaque is no longer down there. It's right outside the cafe, which I think is very appropriate because that's where the youth all gather now today. And I think it's very appropriate that it is there because she has been much missed. And so here we go back to the Harwell Chapel, and here is a memorial to his mother, by her husband and children, and they put this up. So we can keep going on here. There are a lot of other people, but I will just end by telling you that many of these people were people that had money to leave to the church, but not all. And it was my great pleasure when I was about 1990, I had still not returned to teaching, that the Lydian Bible class, that's the business women, not the mothers, young married women, they started a Bible class led by a woman named Janie Alford. Janie Alford had a high school education. She never married. She worked in a stationery shop, but she taught this Sunday school class, and they took on the church library and built the library. And Janie was a remarkably gifted poetry day and night, and left us hymns that Hal Hobson took her poems and put many of them to music, and they are really, really quite lovely. So these are just a few of the people that came through this pipeline of Christians who wanted to be a part of this congregation of faith. And we are still thinking as to, what else we need to do here. We've become very visionary, I think, in the past, since the floods, 15 years. I think we've become have much more outreach than we did once upon a time. And there's a lot of work in this community that needs to be done. So all of us should be thankful for the opportunity to serve Christ here in this setting. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tom.